I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video what we're going to do is to map smart controls. Now, smart controls have been in Logic for a long time, but what we're going to do today is to look at some things that maybe you wouldn't have had a chance to consider in terms of real-time processing of effects using smart controls. So what I've done is to set up RetroSynth, and I've selected one of my favorite sounds, which is called Airy Picks, which is in the, where is it? It's in Sequence Elements, it's the top sound. And the only problem with the default version of this is it's got a really long release time in the amp envelope. And so what I tend to do is just to bring down the release time so it doesn't last so long. Okay, lots of velocity control in this sound, which I really like. Okay, so what we're going to do is to look at what smart controls actually are. So effectively, smart controls allow us to create a parameter set which we can play around with in real time. Now, effectively, when I have RetroSynth open, I can do that already. I could just decide to play some notes here at the same time as manipulating the cutoff dial, for instance, if I wanted to. But that's not quite as much fun as having that parameter, for example, available on a rotary dial. So in order to open smart controls, what I can do is to open the smart controls option here. And what you'll tend to find for most sounds within Logic is that a collection of parameters has already been mapped. And here is the cutoff frequency. It's much easier to manipulate it from this dial than it is from the parameter up here in the filter section. They're doing the same thing, but having a dial is sort of more fun and certainly more malleable and tactile. Now, what I want to do is to sort of take control of my smart controls and decide exactly how I want them to be configured. So what I'm actually going to do is to press the little information button here, which brings up the kind of mappability. There's another word I've made up. I keep making up words on this channel, but I'm going to go with it. The mappability of each of the individual parameters within the smart controls. So effectively what I can do is to decide exactly what I want to map and how it's going to be mapped. Now, in order to really do this properly, we're going to go absolutely belt and braces, go all the way back to the very beginning of mapping smart controls from the start. And to do that, what I'm going to do is to come over to the left-hand side, come to the little drop-down menu here, and I'm going to delete all patch mappings. And what that's going to do is to reset all of the parameters that have been automatically put together for this particular preset. Now I'm starting from scratch. And because I'm starting from scratch, the first thing I can do is to decide how many parameters and exactly how I want them to look they're going to and how they're going to be set up within the smart controls window down here in the first place. So at the moment I'm using what's called Vintage Synth 8, which is effectively a layout, if you like, and I can change that for anything else. If I want to, I could use some acoustic drums. This is the panel that's used in acoustic drum mapping, but effectively it's all the same dials, it's all the same switches. I get to decide exactly how I want these things to be, how I want them to look. So there are lots available for amps and for different combinations too. And down here at the bottom where my Vintage Synth 8 was, here is Vintage Synth 12, which effectively gives me 4 more parameters arranged into 3 groups of 4. So again, I've still got dials, but what I've effectively got is more of them now if I want to work that way. And the advantage of this is that rather than having one long list, I could think about parameters mapped in different sections. I'll show you what I mean. Let's suppose what I want to do to start with is I want to map that cutoff frequency that we had mapped in the first place. There are a couple of ways I could do this. Firstly, I can click on it and then I can go and find the parameter that I want to map. So if I wanted to, I can click on this dial, I can come over here, I can click on RetroSynth, I can come into the filter section and I can select the cutoff frequency, and that maps that parameter to that particular dial. And now when I move this around, just like before, effectively what I've done is to map that first parameter. It's a slightly long-winded way of working, and let's suppose I'd opened Alchemy rather than RetroSynth, the list of available parameters would be really long. So a more fun way to map a parameter is to click on the dial that you want to map and instead press the Learn button. And now Logic is waiting for me to go and find and sort of touch the parameter that I want to map. So if I come up here to the resonance dial, carefully not pressing anything along the way, the moment I do this, effectively resonance gets mapped here as well. So rather than actually having to go and find that parameter out of a menu, instead what I've been able to do is to map it directly by clicking the Learn button and then going and finding the parameter. And the moment I touch it, it maps it. So effectively now what I've got is a resonance control and a filter control as well. And of course I can move between these two. Now, the only problem that you can see is that as I click between the two smart controls, I have to kind of click on one of them before it will begin to work. Now, part of the reason for that is because I'm still in the information page, so this will all become more tactile when I come back into or come out of this page and I just come back to my smart controls. But it's also worth bearing in mind that if you're an iPad user, then obviously all of the smart controls are available here as well. So by clicking on the little down arrow, I can then click on smart controls, and we'll see that the parameters that I've assigned have been mapped. Now we'll see that everything else is empty, and one thing that's worth knowing about the iPad is that if I map another parameter now, if I decide to select this one and to press the learn button, and let's suppose this time what I want to do is to control the envelope amount, I can see that it's mapped on screen, but that hasn't appeared over here on the iPad. I can play the notes, but that first parameter or the new parameter hasn't been mapped. In order to see it, I just need to come out of or go to any of the other drop-down menus, come back into smart controls, and it will update. So if you're working with an iPad and you want to be able to see those controls build as you go, don't be surprised if they don't just automatically update. You may have to just jump out of that menu and come back in. Okay, so far, so straightforward. What I could keep doing would maybe to go and find another parameter for the filter section, and I could map that too. And obviously now I've got real-time control over these to decide exactly how I want them to work. And as you can see, for now, I'm having to click twice to select the parameter before then changing it. It will be different when we come out of this page. Now, one thing I might want to do would be to start thinking about parameters that are going to be maybe a little bit less expected, or something that I might want in some way to be able to change in real time, but with a limited range value. Now, let me show you what I mean. One thing that might be interesting would be to say, okay, well, the decay time in the amp envelope would be an interesting parameter to change. And in fact, we've made a video about envelopes and the power of those, so do go and watch that if you're unfamiliar with how envelopes work. Now, in real time, if I was to change the decay time as I play these notes, what we'll hear is the difference in the sound as we manipulate the decay time. Now, what's interesting about that is it gives me a really nice little performance element. It might even sharpen up the attack time a little bit as well. But the moment I get above a certain point, the value of an extended decay time becomes much less. In other words, right at the beginning, this is really dramatic. And it's still dramatic. But above about this length, or maybe a little bit longer, I'm not going to want this sound ever to get longer than, let's say, 370 milliseconds. So all of this extra range up to 10 seconds, I don't need. So the first thing I'm going to do is to say, okay, I want to map this parameter because I want to be able to play with it. I'm going to click here, I'm going to press learn, and I'm going to assign the decay time. Okay, that's the first thing. That's fine. That's working nicely. So effectively now I've got control over that parameter. What I want to do now is to change the range control of exactly how much I'm going to adjust the decay time. I don't need all of that extra decay time. So over here on the left hand side, what I can do is to set a range around the minimum and maximum values I want to assign to this parameter. So I think my shortest value was around, I don't know, I can't remember, about, let's say, 10 milliseconds. We can adjust it again in a minute if we need to. And the maximum range wasn't anywhere near 10 seconds. What I want to do is to cap this at about, I don't know, 400 milliseconds I think I was working at. So what I've effectively got now is I've controlled the range of this dial. And now rather than going all the way from 0 up to 10 seconds, it goes from 12 milliseconds up to 400 milliseconds. And in fact, that is a little bit short. What I'll do is to take that up to more like 50. And again, I need to touch that dial for it to update. Yeah, that's better. Okay, so now what we've done is to map not just to control, but what we've also done is to decide exactly how we want that to kind of unfold, and by setting its range around it as well. Now, the other thing that I want to be able to do with this particular dial is to match a number of different parameters to it. I want this dial to control not just the decay time, but some other things too, like, for example, the length of a reverb. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to set up an auxiliary send over here, and I'm going to set up bus send number 1. I'm going to turn it up. And what I'm then going to do is to go and find chromaverb. And I'm going to set I'll come and choose a parameter. I'm going to choose the airy setting, and I'm going to turn the decay time up so that we've got plenty of reverb on this dial. So what I want to be able to do is to control this bus send at the same time as controlling this envelope decay. In other words, I want this one dial to add reverb amount as well as increase the length of the actual note that's playing. In other words, one dial to control two parameters. So the way that I can do that is to come over here and I can see the first one has been set up, retro synth, amp, envelope, decay. And what I then want to do with this parameter still selected is to add a mapping. And I can do that here by clicking on the little down arrow and then selecting add mapping. And now I've got a list. So what I've got a chance to do now is to come and find the parameter that I want to change, which of course is going to be in the main section. It's not in retro synth, it's in the main section, and it's actually going to be the send one to auxiliary number one. Now, because I haven't named auxiliary number one, this is where my chroma verb is. I need to remember that it's auxiliary number one, and I want to make it the absolute level here. Now, this is going to do two things. Firstly, this parameter is now going to control the amp envelope, but also you can see that over there on the bus send, what it's doing as well is it is increasing the amount of reverb. And that's really nice because now the sound gets long and it gets big and bright. And we already know that if this is too much, what I can do would be to cap the amount of level that this can possibly send to. So if I want to, I can just trim the maximum amount, and I can even set a minimum amount as well. If I want there to be some reverb on the sound, even when the decay time is as short as possible, it's still going to have a little bit of reverb on it. But now when I push this level up, it's not going to climb quite as high. And again, I can just adjust that to taste. And that's working nicely. Now then, what if I wanted to be able to make this control be something that I could actually control as an active parameter? Well, that would be the next thing that I could potentially do. What I'm going to do is to add this to a particular controller assignment on my keyboard. And what I want to do is to add it to the modulation lane. Now, the modulation lane is currently providing me with a little bit of modulation. So just like a mod wheel often does, we've got now an LFO going into the oscillator section, and that's giving us this kind of nice big chorusy kind of effect. And what I want to do is I'm going to add this parameter into there as well. And what I'm going to do is to press the learn button for an external assignment. Now, what that basically means is rather than mapping a specific dial as I have been so far, what instead I'm going to do is to learn this or teach it to a particular assignment. And the moment I touch my mod wheel, I can see that the control change, controller number one, has been added in here as well. I can come out of learn mode, and now, in addition to that chorus effect, I can now see that I've got real-time control over that dial. So effectively that dial is now controlling three things. It's giving me the internal modulation I was getting within retro synth, it's giving me extra reverb, and it's giving me extra amp envelope as well. And of course, I can control those things on the iPad as well if I want to actually create my changes here. So far, so good. But what else could I potentially do? Now, you might remember around Christmas time, I made a video called the One Note Track. And what we did was to create one note and send it to a whole series of auxiliaries where effectively we had a chance to take one note and turn it into an entire sort of sequency piece of music that was about 8 bars long. And we did that methodically going through by changing individual parameters and setting up particular effects chains. Well, of course, this would be a really interesting way of configuring a piece like that. If you imagine that all of these dials were effectively different auxiliary sends, then you could, in real time, map all of these controls, take your one note track and literally use the dials to introduce those different pathways for those notes to go down. That'd be a really interesting thing to do. But what we can also do is to use different types of trigger to switch on individual types of effect. I'm going to show you what I mean. Let's set up a second auxiliary. To make life easy, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this reverb so that we know that bus 1 is a reverb. And what I'm then going to do is to set up a second auxiliary, and this one is going to be delay. Now, what I want to do is to create a stereo delay effect. So I'm going to come into the delay folder, come and find stereo delay. And what I'm going to do is to create a delay which is, let's say, an 8th note on the left-hand side and a dotted 8th note on the right. So I'm going to just select those parameters. And what I'll also do is to turn up the feedback levels a little bit in both channels so we're hearing these really clearly. I'm not going to spend too much time here. All I want is a delay that works. And there it is. Now, effectively what I want to be able to do is to control whether this switches on or not from a smart control routing. So in other words, I want to be in a position where I can decide whether or not this is going to switch on or not directly from a smart control. So in other words, if I was to bypass this effect, no delay, and if I switch it on, I get my delay. So what I want to do is to map this parameter, the delay sort of switch that turns on this or not. Now then, I could map that to an individual control, but a rotary doesn't really make sense in quite the same way. I don't want this to be something that is gradiated. It's effectively a switch, an on and off switch. So what I'm instead going to do is I'm going to map this parameter. I'm going to come down here, and what I want to do is to say, okay, I want to learn this parameter. I'm going to press the learn button, and what I'm going to do is to turn it on and off. And now we've got a send mute amount control. So effectively, as I turn this on and off, effectively we've got a chance to scroll through whether or not it switches on and off. But again, you can see that a dial doesn't really make sense. I'm having to kind of rock this up and down to go from on to off. What I want to do is to make that a control that I can trigger from a specific place. Hopefully you're keeping up with this. Now then, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to see whether or not I can assign that switch to a key command actually on my MIDI keyboard. Now at the moment, the keyboard range obviously extends from the very highest note to the very lowest. I can jump up through the octaves and down, and I can keep going. But what I'm going to do is to say, you know what, I reckon the lowest note that I want to play is this note here. This synth sound is only going to go down to, let's say, C2, which is here. I don't need it to play any notes below C2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to restrict the key range of this sound from C2 up to G8, and I'm doing it here. You can see the key limit is set here. So what I can do is to say, okay, I'm going to make sure that the lowest note that I can play is C2, which is here. And the moment I play a note lower, it doesn't make any sound. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to use this note, which is B1, as a trigger for my mute. Okay, so let's come back into our smart controls. What I want to do is I want to trigger this from B1, and I can do that by clicking on this dial. I can then hit learn, and what I can then do is to hit B1. And what's going to happen is that note B1 is now the switch for that send mute. So when I press this key, it's going to trigger on and off. And you can see that that is happening over here. Now the only problem is that when I hold it down, it's muted. And when I let go of it, it's on. So in other words, I get delay until I hold the key down, at which point it's off. Well, I want it to be the other way around. I want to decide to switch that on, not turn it off. So what I need to do is to press the invert button. And when I do that, that switch goes the other way around. Now I need to hold it down to switch it on. And when I let go of it, it switches off. So now what I've got is a key switch, which is allowing me to control a particular dial over here. And at the same time, I've got my modulation lane, which is allowing me to control the way that the sound behaves from a reverb and decay point of view. So now I've got my mod wheel here controlling the length of the note and the reverb, and I've got B1 controlling whether or not I introduce delay as well. So what we can see with smart controls is that they go way further than default sort of packs of those that are put together for each individual sound. Remember, what we did was to completely strip out all of the routings available to us, and we started again from scratch. We started by pressing the learn button and simply assigning key parameters within the filter section over here on the left-hand side. What we've done on the right-hand side is to start thinking much more deeply about how we might want real-time control over our sounds. So effectively what we've done is to map one parameter or one dial to multiple parameters, and now we've even restricted key range and used a key switch as a kind of trigger for how sounds are going to work with individual effects. So we know that individual keys can work as triggers. We know that physical dials can be used as triggers. So if you've got a controller with lots of dials and maps, you can effectively literally map those to as many different controls as you like. Remember, simply click on one and then simply just press learn and set the external assignment that you want. And again, thinking again about that one note piece, you can begin to think, okay, well actually I could create a basic sound and create multiple auxiliaries, all with their own dials, sending that sound down sort of different pathways. So you could make a version of the one note track where actually all of that content didn't need to be automated. You could literally trigger it in real time from the physical dials on your screen. Smart controls go deep.